Hey y'all, here OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the NUU N30, and some of you guys may remember that recently we also reviewed the NUU N10, which I really liked. As a refresher, this was a sub $100 phone, offering surprisingly capable performance for the money, along with a metal chassis, as well as a fingerprint scanner and stereo speakers. And it was powered by the Unisoc T606 octa-core processor, which is, I think, a fair choice in the super budget price that this phone is sitting at. So as the name implies, the N30 is designed to be slightly higher end compared to the N10, even though it's still a budget phone in its own right. Instead of a 12 megapixel camera on the rear, we now have a 50 megapixel primary lens on the N30, and upgrades from 4 gigabytes of RAM to now 6 gigabytes of RAM, along with trading the Unisoc processor for a MediaTek Helio G80 octa-core chip, which is just a hair faster in terms of benchmarks, and compared to the predecessor, which is really the NUU A15 that we reviewed this time last year, I would argue that this N30 might be a better true successor, because it has a similar colorway, although it's closer to blue compared to the violet or purple of the A15, but we can definitely tell a closer semblance when it comes to the design language, and also both of these phones are using MediaTek chips. The older A15 was using the G36, which for context has roughly 145K and 2210 score compared to the Helio G80, although it's by no means a flagship chip, has a more respectable 247K on Antutu, so over 70% increase in the compute performance, as well as a 40% faster GPU frequency as well. So this is going to feel noticeably faster and smoother in everyday performance compared to the G36 found on the A15. If we are comparing them side by side, it definitely chugs a little bit more. This is now a closer match to Qualcomm Snapdragon 600 series or 6th Gen series chips. Granted, the MediaTek G80's performance isn't night and day different compared to the Unisoc T606. It's about 3,000 points higher, but this is a much closer margin, and in everyday usage I found these to be more evenly matched. So I would say between the two newer N-series phones, you don't get necessarily as big of an incremental bump between the 10 as well as the 30. But anyways, all three phones have relatively large 6.67-inch screens, and all three are still HD plus resolution, or 720p, along with having 90 Hz faster refresh rate. Again, I think this was perfectly serviceable on the N10, considering how inexpensive it was. I've even seen it on sale for as low as $80 during the holiday season, which is just insane. So it's reasonable in this price range, although for the N30, I would have liked if they had upgraded that or bumped it to 1080p. That being said, you do get the benefit of slightly longer battery endurance, as well as technically a little bit more fluid performance, since the GPU has to push fewer pixels around. And like the N10, this N30 here, of course, retains the stereo speakers coming out from the bottom as well as on the very top, so you do get a bit more of that immersive audio, and it retains a standard 3.5mm headphone jack as well, if you prefer that to Bluetooth connectivity, which, by the way, the A15 is lacking the stereo speaker support. And also on the front, the N30 now adopts a slightly smaller hole punch cutout, as you can tell there, versus the teardrop notch found on the A15, so you have slightly smaller bezels on this newest model, although the N10 also adopted a similar design already, albeit maybe with slightly thicker bezels, but honestly the display quality on both of the N-series phones I would say is roughly on par with one another. Both are good enough quality IPS LCD panels. Now, with that being said, design is the aspect that I find to be a little bit more subjective, just because I was a huge fan of the white finish on the N10. I think it looks really classy and minimalistic versus the more gradient finish found on the N30 that might seem a little bit more flashy, but keep in mind the sides of the phone this time are constructed out of polycarbonate plastic compared to metal or aluminum on the N10, at least on the white version that is. I saw in the comments last time that some folks actually preferred the plastic finish because they felt like it was maybe smoother, slightly lighter, and still durable enough, but personally I think metal just gives it a bit more of a premium touch that I would have liked to see, but it is what it is. Both have pretty much identical placements though for the volume rocker as well as the power key, which is integrated with a fingerprint scanner that feels relatively responsive. I/O is quite similar aside from the headphone jack being flipped compared to the N10 was on top, now the N30 is on the bottom, and both use USB Type-C charging at 18 watts to fill up the 5,000 mAh capacity battery inside, so it's not going to be lightning fast like on some of their more flagship devices, but mostly fills up in around an hour and a half in my usage. On the side here, you'll also find the SIM card slot, which as you can tell can hold 2 SIM cards as well as 1 micro SD card to augment the 128GB of built-in storage if needed. And otherwise on the rear, again, we have a slightly more complicated design. It is a little bit busier for better or for worse, and protrudes from the edges a little bit more, although with a case attached, it can still mostly be flattened out. We have more of an oversized LED flash ring, along with, again, the primary camera, assisted by a 2-megapixel macro lens, which is also found on the N10, but this time you also get additional camera lens here to act as a depth sensor when you're taking portrait bokeh shots, as well as another one which is more of a decorative module that doesn't really do anything, it's just here for the sake of symmetry. So it's a solid design, although the N10 is just a touch cleaner in my personal opinion, but not bad. Packaging contents are still quite similar versus their previous phones, and it's inclusive of a sticker, quick user guide, as well as a included TPU silicone case. Always nice to find this thrown in the box, and again, it makes the camera bump not as noticeable if you're setting it down. It's now mostly flat. You'll also get a SIM ejector pen along with a USB Type-C charging cable and also an 18-watt charging adapter brick. Kind of ironic that we don't get those bundled in more expensive flagship phones anymore, but you get it on a budget device like this. And also there is a factory pre-applied screen protector as well to prevent any scratches on the display. Another thoughtful little extra. From a software point of view, the phone is currently running on Android 14. Thankfully, it hasn't been filled up with too much bloatware from NUU's part, aside from just a help application that you can click on to get support, as well as a built-in FM radio app to take advantage of the headphone jack acting as the antenna, and there's also their voice recorder. Everything else, though, is stock to Android, including their utility tools and access to the regular Play Store. So you can expect over 105 gigabytes of space for you to install your programs, as well as media files with when you first take it out of the box, which is not bad. That being said, on the topic of potential software updates, it's always a little bit tricky when it comes to these smaller manufacturers compared to, say, the Google Pixel or Samsung Galaxy smartphone teams. So it's an area where hopefully we'll continue to see improvements on down the road, since this is likely the OS version the phone will remain on, although firmware updates will still be provided over to the device, improving on the stability at times. Also, keep in mind that this is a 4G LTE unlocked quad-band device, so it's going to be compatible with most GSM carriers, including, say, T-Mobile here in the US, or as you're traveling internationally, just pop in your SIM card. But for some of the former CDMA networks, it remains an area where it's a little bit more difficult to get an unlocked device outside of the largest players like Apple or, again, Google. But just keep that in mind, it's a similar situation to most other unlocked phones, but just worth briefly flagging. Thankfully, the actual call quality itself, though, seems to be quite clear. Testing it with T-Mobile here in the Seattle region, I didn't really have any issues from a reception point of view, thanks to the plastic chassis here, and the microphone as well as the speaker were both pretty loud and clean. Here's a quick demo. Hello, this is a quick test of the microphone, which is also helped by the built-in stereo speakers as well. Anyways, we do have access to the regular Google Assistant here on the left of the home page. We can also pull down on the notification shade to access some quick shortcuts to various utility functions. And if we jump into the full settings here, you'll find some typical options under display, allowing you to change the refresh rate, dialing it down to 60 Hz if you want to consume less power. There is a lift to wake functionality, although no double tap to wake the screen on this particular software variant. There is adaptive brightness though, so there is a proximity light sensor on the top as well that can change the screen brightness, and then other functions are mostly standard to Android, save for DuraSpeed, that is a common function found on most MediaTek phones, allowing you to boost the system's performance by closing out of background apps for resource-intensive purposes like gaming, for instance. And also for those wondering, yes, you can bring back the virtual on-screen buttons if you prefer that to the gesture-based navigation method, just like any standard Android smartphone these days. And last but not least, there is extended or virtual RAM capability on here as well, getting up to 6 gigabytes total, and that just supplements the 6 gigs of built-in physical RAM for up to 12 gigabytes. That helps a little bit when you are multitasking, borrowing some of the ROM or system storage to act as that virtual RAM. So that combined amount will be a little bit greater versus, again, the N10, which only had 4 gigabytes of physical RAM, also consistent on the A15. So if you are running more applications in the background, this can just jump back and forth a little bit more fluidly and still keep some of those apps running. Speaking of jumping into the camera UI next, this is also an area where there have been some subtle improvements versus these two other phones. It's now stacked with more software features than ever before. There's AI auto scene detection. It will adjust some of the properties automatically, as well as HDR that you can turn on in conjunction with the AI scene detection, with additional settings inclusive of watermark, geotagging your photos, as well as the default filters that you can apply whenever you jump into the camera can now all be set. In fact, within the camera app, you can even hide or disable disable certain features or tabs that you don't commonly use to make it less cluttered. For instance, you can now even find a pro video recording mode, a faster shutter speed sport mode, AR emojis, kind of borrowing that from Samsung and Apple, as well as capturing macro shots. So based on how many of these features you're using and the layout, you can also play around with, which is an improvement versus the other camera apps on these two devices did not give you this extent of customization. Even details including the camera shutter sound when you're capturing a shot, if you want to hear an audible click, can be changed. So we can hear how that will vary accordingly. We can flip to the front-facing selfie lens, which is 8 megapixels, also a little higher than the 5 megapixel sensor found on the N10, along with using Google Lens to recognize barcodes and search up objects. You can also do a 2x digital crop, but again, this particular setup doesn't have a telephoto zoom lens, so it is a digital zoom, but at this particular magnification, it still looks alright. The further in that you zoom past this point, will start to look a bit more fuzzy and compressed. And there's also no ultra-wide-angle lens, which I do think is a little bit of a shame. They probably could have incorporated that into one of the camera modules as part of the N30's design, but it is what it is. Video recording quality is still capped at Full HD, the same as the N10 by the way, so if you want higher res, you still have to look towards some of their more premium offerings, it seems. And by the way, if you choose to enable the drag up method of navigation, you can also find again all of the other options a little bit more easily. And to their credit, the overall camera UI doesn't feel too sluggish to use, relatively quick, and you have the night mode here as well, which will increase the exposure time to capture some more details. That being said, you have to hold relatively still because it doesn't have OIS or optical image stabilization like most of the other budget phones in this price range. What you will find though is a dedicated film scene mode, which is actually quite fun. So if you want to replicate the effect of shooting on a kind of old-fashioned camera, you can find some of these filters a little bit more easily, whether it's black and white or cinematic, so on and so forth, which is a detail that is missing on all of their prior offerings, as well as a Ultra HD mode, and that's because the regular photo mode is binning the images down to around 13 megapixels, so it's compressing 4 pixels into 1 to also save on space, but this will capture the full 50 megapixel resolution, albeit in this mode you aren't able to leverage the AI or the HDR effects, but it will get you a little bit more if you want to crop in and zoom into some of your shots. There's also the portrait bokeh, you can change the blur level, as well as a beauty mode on this one as well, where you can further adjust properties like the skin, hiding some imperfections, and the Pro Video UI allows you to change settings like ISO, white balance manually, and the aforementioned AR emoji allows you to pop a sticker, some moving animations over a person's face when they are standing within the frame. It'll be recognized. You can even choose some other stickers and special effects to apply onto the shot. A fun little extra. And also the filter functionality here is different from the film effects. You get even more colors to pick between, including muted, saturated, slightly more reddish versus bluish, cooler versus warmer, so on and so forth. So there are quite a few effects that you can toggle around with instead of doing those in post. And there's also a document correction function. So as a quick example, if we are pointing at a document or book, you can see that it will recognize the overall shape and then try to scan in just that section and make it more flattened out. So here's one example where it seems like I was capturing it here from the top, even though we were really capturing it from the side, making it a little bit more legible as you are sharing some of the prints and documents. One software enhancement versus their prior generation camera app. More than satisfactory when it comes to a budget phone camera. Again, as long as you are holding relatively still, you can get some even natural bokeh just by focusing on objects up close, as well as the HDR trying to capture some details in some of the shadow regions. So it's not bad, kind of reminds me of a Samsung Galaxy, maybe A series phone when it comes to some of the color signs here, but looking vibrant enough. So here's one instance of that, again, bin down, nearly 13 megapixel image, which takes up around 8 megabytes. In comparison, here's the Ultra HD version of the same photo, so 50 megapixels now, but as you can tell, without HDR, some of the details in the tree shadow region gets crushed a little bit more. However, you are able to zoom in more, so on the binned result, we can zoom in this far onto the leaves, versus on, again, the full Ultra HD version, we are able to zoom in just a little bit closer to the same part of the photo. It's not bad, but keep in mind it will take up a bit more space as well, around 19 megabytes for the Ultra HD photo. Here's also one instance of the 2 megapixel macro lens if you wanted to get a little bit more close up to objects. Working alright, but again, the resolution here is definitely much lower versus the primary camera, and personally I find an ultra wide angle or a telephoto zoom lens to be more practical, but it's a similar tactic employed on many other budget phones in this price range. The fully laminated IPS LCD screen also offers, I think, generous enough viewing angles and accurate looking colors, as you can tell here by some of the built-in wallpapers that you can use to further customize the look of the phone. Moving into a quick web browsing test next, as you can tell here, loading times are actually quite respectable, so as you are just generally using this for basic navigation, looking at different articles, more than smooth enough thanks to also the 90 Hz refresh rate of the panel. So if you are using this for, again, reading back articles, you won't find it to be too problematic. We can even request the full desktop version of the site. It's a relatively complex web page, plenty of different videos and scrolling elements, as well as ads, but the overall loading speed is still seeming relatively responsive. We can also hop back and forth between, again, the previous articles, and they're still held in the system RAM. So not bad for basic navigation. Let's also jump into a YouTube video, hear what the speakers sound like. Alright, so turning the volume a little bit lower there, takeaway is it is actually quite immersive, thanks to, again, that stereo pair, and pretty well balanced on this model. It doesn't seem like the bottom one is significantly louder compared to the top. The loading times, as well as buffering between parts of the video, all seem to be respectable enough as well. So when it comes to some casual entertainment, coupled with a relatively large display that gets generally bright enough unless you are in direct sunlight. If you're in a shaded region, I think it still looks solid enough for a budget phone, I would say, unless you are pixel peeping. But if you are just focusing on the overall image, again, from the perspective of color, it's not bad for just consuming some clips on YouTube as well as Netflix. And yes, the phone does also support picture-in-picture mode for multitasking and still seems to be running alright as well. Now, I suppose one attribute that might be beneficial on a mostly plastic chassis here is it is surprisingly quite lightweight for a larger phone, again, nearly 6.7-inch screen, even though it doesn't really flex or feel too hollow or anything like that, but definitely a bit lighter than you'll expect when first picking it up. So it's not going to strain your hands quite as much compared to heavier phones with a similar screen size, particularly if you're holding up for entertainment as well as gaming, for instance. It might feel just a little bit more comfortable, which, speaking of, here is a quick demo. So for some casual gaming, it can definitely handle most of the titles that you're trying to throw at it, whether it's going to be these lighter tap-and-go style games, or even slightly more demanding titles like PUBG, Asphalt series, Minecraft will still run on here as well. There's really no application as well as social media tool that you can't download from the store, getting a respectable overall playback experience. That being said, if you are a competitive gamer, then of course, keep in mind this is still more of an entry-level budget phone, all things considered, so you probably won't get lightning fast frame rates on more AAA style games, but for, again, casual gaming, it is doing a little bit better than expected, and overall, the phone does get a touch warmer if you're pressing it a little harder for more than, say, 30 minutes or so, but never gets too hot. So generally speaking, thermal throttling wasn't an issue that I encountered. Performance was relatively stable. So the takeaway there is to have reasonable expectations. For casual everyday use, it actually feels a little bit more responsive than expected, just giving it a beat there to load initially. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of the NUU N30, still a budget Android smartphone. And I really think this is an interesting case because on one hand, I do believe the N10 might be an even stronger value, but as we mentioned previously, design is subjective, and if you are a fan of the kind of purple violet haze, you want something a little bit more lightweight and glimmers from a design perspective, then you can still find this to be attractive enough, not to mention that it does have a few benefits, including a higher res main camera, slightly better if you are zooming and cropping in, coupled with more software enhancements in the camera app that were missing on the prior devices, as well as, again, still retaining the stereo speaker support, 3.5mm headphone jack, dual SIM plus micro SD for expanding the 128 gigs of storage, a little bit more RAM, as well as a faster processor compared to the A15, still makes it a solid upgrade if you are looking at it from that perspective. Although some of the more premium elements like NFC as well as IP rating and wireless charging still remain attributes you can't really expect on a phone in this price range, but all in all, it's really not a bad offering when it comes to just general navigation, using it again for communications. It handles the basics quite well for making calls, feeling fast and fluid enough for media consumption, web browsing, and everyday tasks that you're throwing at it, making it a pretty good alternative to some other smartphones from companies like Blue, Poco, as well as Xiaomi, Redmi, particularly if you're in the US, since NUU seems to have a little bit more support and offices located here locally. So you can check out out more details if you are interested in the links down below. Again, this is kind of their halfway step in between their more pro devices and also their most budget phones, sharing some of the features and elements from both sides, but definitely an improvement versus the, again, A15 from last year. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews.